Okay, welcome to all of those who are tuning in, whether they're watching this or listening to this. With me today is Gary from Michigan. So Gary Step from Michigan has been in ministry for almost or over 2 decades now, 10 years with the United Methodist Conference. In training and development. Before that, 12 years as a pastor. And prior to that, a career in business. And so a wealth of knowledge and experience, especially when it comes to organizational effectiveness. And I'm really excited to have Gary with us today to share some wisdom and insights, specifically as it relates to vision, mission, and creating in cultures that engage those in ministry. So Gary, I'll let you go ahead and get us started by just helping us to better understand the role of vision and mission when it comes to leading churches that are effective.
Sure. So currently I work for the United Methodist Foundation of Michigan, and I've been there like less than a year. And then before that, I worked on conference staff. So I worked a lot in the field with revitalization. So I worked a lot with churches. I've actually worked with churches for the last 10 years or 12 years, moving them to this type of structure. So it's changed dramatically over 12 years. I got to tell you that. But the reason why we're changing to that structure and nonprofits are changing to that simplified accountable structure is one of the names for it, or simple governance, right? And the reason why they're moving to that structure is they found that they are not accomplishing their mission. That's nonprofits too. And what's happening is the structure around them, the committee around them is actually trying to micromanage the decision-making of the leaders. And this is what happens in a church. You have this large structure with a committee that runs the church. In the United Methodist Church, it's called a council. Other churches, it's called something else. But what happens is they begin to micromanage. They actually try to manage the day-to-day affairs of the church. And about 12 years ago, the Baptist Church started to realize that this was affecting their whole ministry in every one of their churches. So the structure in our churches is very antiquated, and it's based on like a democratic process, a voting process, rather than a leadership and allowing leaders to lead. So in a simplified accountable structure, what we found is most churches are not running on mission and vision. Mission is, right, to make disciples for Jesus Christ. The vision is, how do we do that here in our context? What we found is in the structure of the church that the structure actually drives the vision. So what do I mean by that? So your calendaring, the way we always did things, runs the vision of the church. Relationships, in other words, we're going to hurt somebody if we make a decision. And so if everybody's not all in on that decision, then we won't go in that direction. But if you notice, none of it has to do with the mission of the church. So the question is, how do we pull the mission back front and center, put it in the driver's seat, so to speak? And I think I mentioned this in a previous recording, but it takes 4 to 7 years to change the culture of the church. And the longer, if you're familiar with the life cycle of the church, and hopefully most leaders are, the longer you linger on the downside of that life cycle, the harder it is actually to tear away. There's a tearing away as you try to put vision into the driver's seat, right? And you can almost hear the pain, and it's the people feel the loss of what we've always done. And that's why it's so hard to change the course of a church. So the simplified accountable structure changes the structure, but you also have to change the culture of the church.
Well, and I mean, yeah, if you're not, culture is probably just as important, if not more important, because you can have a great structure, but if the culture is not aligned with where you're going, it's not gonna.
So the fallback is what you've done before, right? So when you're trying to change the structure of the church to a more simplified accountable structure, This particular method in Mission Possible, the book Mission Possible, what they do is they collapse all the administrative positions into one oversight committee, right? And they're a visioning arm of the church then. So they're visioning the administrative pieces of the church, but they're not managing. And that's the important part. And that's the hard part because a lot of the churches want to micromanage, right? The church and the decisions made. And so the separation is there. How do we separate management from vision? And that management from those administrative pieces. Now, once we're able to do that, then the administrative arm begins to, grasp and understand the mission of the church. So key point there is to have leaders on that team, right, that understand the mission and vision of the church in the deepest way.
Yeah, on the administrative arm, it's really important to make sure that those persons are understanding that and also understanding role clarification, right? Understanding their role, not as a micromanager, but as the chief visioning officers for the congregation.
And they're creating the boundaries for the ministry within the church. They're creating budgets. They're creating the playing field, so to speak, for the teams of the church that are actually doing ministry, right? So the shift is pretty difficult. Okay, I tell pastors and churches it's one of the hardest cultural shifts that you'll do. Why? Because a lot of churches now think that the ministry of the church rests in the administrative positions, and they've created multiple administrative positions for people to be in ministry. When this structure is put in place, what happens is it collapses those ministries down, and people will say, well, I don't have a place to serve anymore. It's powerful. And what else I've noticed is in a lot of churches, especially denominational churches, is we've created small groups in our administrative structure. So how we communicate is we go to all these meetings, right? And then we know what's going on. So when you collapse that structure, you have a lot of forces against it saying, I don't have a place to do ministry. I don't know what's going on anymore. So obviously communication, key leaders in these positions, helping people find their ministry within the church when you make the shift. What happens though is you're able to now focus on mission and vision as that smaller group. You're able to make decisions much quicker. You're more nimble. You can actually make decisions by sending out emails. And before, you might have to go to 3 different committee meetings just to get approval for a ministry, right? Now, the pastor and the staff, if you have a larger church, but a smaller church, it's the same way. Now, those folks can do ministry as long as they're aligned with the mission and vision of the church. And now that support structure, so that board is now supporting the ministry of the church. When they get together, they're talking about how are we accomplishing the mission of the church? How is our visioning doing? They usually, once I have that in place for about a year, I do a fall retreat. And then we start strategic planning. What are we going to accomplish in the next year? And so then we break the vision down into a strategy. And when they meet together, now they're talking about the strategy about where they're going, rather than before the reporting, where we've done, what we've done, the ministry we've done, and they don't even talk usually about the effectiveness of that ministry. So this new board would be aligning the ministry, would be making sure the ministry is effective, it's changing lives, transforming lives. And so it takes about a year for this shift to happen. And as long as you can get that culture to shift, then I think this is the key for most churches to really start on a nice platform of understanding the mission and the vision, And this gives you the undergirding structure to now do ministry and reach the world for Jesus Christ.
Gary, let's take just a minute to talk about
Yeah.
that year,
Yeah.
because I feel like in a lot of cases, people have tried to shift to a simplified accountability structure and something didn't go wrong. And I suspect it's because of forces working against, culture not being supportive.
Yes.
Let's talk about that year that you have mentioned a couple of times now. What are some simple yet incredibly important things that the ministry leaders, the pastor, whoever needs to do in order to support and encourage and enable this change to happen over that year? What are some keys there?
So the key to any kind of change is people are grieving loss. So I think you have to address the loss. And the number one loss is finding places for people to serve that have served for a long time. It sounds, it doesn't sound, like that critical, but believe it or not, if you don't cover that base, I had a church where we had to go back. We kind of backtracked where the process fell apart, and this was one of the keys. Helping understand people through that loss of communication. So you have to create, so during that year, you have to over communicate in a dramatic way to the congregation and create new ways to communicate to that congregation and make sure that what you're doing is not like some secret meeting that nobody knows about, right? So after you meet, you make that well known. Here's what we talked about. Here's what we did. A lot of the downfall is not communicating with the larger church what's going on as you move forward. I would also say once churches make it over this year hurdle, they would never go back. And that's lay people. That's all people involved in leadership say they would never go back to the way they did ministry before. But it is a hurdle to get through that year. Another thing, I would just recommend finding a coach. I go into the church and I actually sit at their meetings and, answer their questions, help them understand, how they function. So there's this wrestling about what are we supposed to be doing? How are we supposed to function? Because it's so different. And so having somebody there that understands the structure and how it's supposed to function is very helpful. So a coach, if possible, is really extremely helpful.
Right. Even if it's just occasional or with technology.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, we're going to close here,
Sure.
but this is also really, really helpful. What my takeaways are from our short time together were just the importance of being thoughtful and intentional. If you're moving into simplified accountability structure, or maybe you're already there, maybe it was a little bit messy, who knows, but maybe taking some time to reflect on how this move is going to be most effective, paying attention to things like communication. What is our communication strategy? I like the idea of communicating in a dramatic way, making sure that the entire congregation, whether that's really small or medium or even large, is aware of what's going on. But also be mindful that it does take 4 to 7 years. So patience really is a virtue in this process. Incorporating the right kind of training and development doesn't have to be super formal, but just so that people understand what their roles are and how things are different than they may have been before. So encouraging them to kind of maybe let go of that micromanagement. But a key to that, which I think is really, really important, is making sure that you're being thoughtful about where to put people so they still have the opportunity to serve and be filled and fulfilled in the way that they're doing that, especially as you're looking at navigating a shift and getting buy-in from your congregational members as you move forward into that. Did I miss anything in the keys?
So that part of that shift of those people finding places, one of the pushbacks I get is like trustees. Well, who's going to take care of this whole building? So there's these differences of people that are the administrative arm are doing trustees work, and they're doing the insurance, they're making sure the money is there to care for the building. But then you create a team that has hands-on, that like to work on the building, like to do those things. So it's understanding to make those teams up, like the money. When you manage money, you need counters, you need this base to help that, but that's teamwork versus committee work. You see what I mean? And so creating these other administrative teams help, but then you can create more ministry teams too. And I think that helps, that understanding has helped more churches than I can tell you.
Well, Gary, I don't know how much time you have for people to reach out to you, but I will share your information if you have some helpful tips or advice. I know you've done a lot of work in this space. I really appreciate you taking time to be with us today.
Sure.
I've learned a lot from you. I'm sure that the scholars who are listening in will as well. So thank you so much. We appreciate you and we wish you a wonderful day.
Thanks for the invite.